welcome all. Great to see many of you joining us today. So first, what I'd like to do before we dive into the emissions targets analysis in our latest report, Absolute Impact 2023, I'd just really like to set the scene on this. So I'll just talk briefly through our framework here at Carbon Tracker around how we go about assessing climate alignment for oil and gas companies, and why we think this is particularly important, and why we think it's important to a number of different audiences. Clearly, we're assessing climate risk and climate alignment, but also these metrics that we'll discuss are really important for assessing, analysing, companies, their transition risk exposure, and then their strategic response as well. So what I'd like to do is give a really high-level overview. First up, Paris alignment requires planning for production declines. There's no way around this. Whether you look at a 1.5 degree scenario and rapid decline over the next 3 decades, or you look at it to a 1.5 degree scenario with limited overshoot, or you look at a looser interpretation of the Paris goals of well below 2 degrees C, the reality is that oil demand and gas and coal will need to fall rapidly. Under some scenarios that are well below 2 degrees, there is some short-term growth this decade before, for example, under that scenario shown in purple there, the forecast policy scenario, which is a 1.7 degree scenario. The reality is that oil, even under such a scenario, oil will peak this decade and then fall even more rapidly through the 2030s. You see there in the scenario at the top, the red scenario, which is the International Energy Agency's stated policy scenario, a 2.5 degree scenario, oil demand effectively plateauing through out to 2050. But of course, that's well in excess of Paris limits. So it's inescapable that for countries or individual companies to be viewed as Paris aligned, they must be planning for production declines. And it was only today we've seen in the FT an op-ed from Fatih Birol showing how the IEA now sees coal, oil and gas demand peaking ever sooner than previously forecast, showing the transition is well underway and is only accelerating. This, of course, requires companies to plan for faster declines, but also exposes investors and both on credit and debt side, to much greater increased transition risk if companies fail to act in time. So managing the peak will be challenging. Short-term higher pricing, as we've seen over the last 18 months, does lead to increased risk of overinvestment, particularly thinking about long duration projects, whether that's mega projects offshore oil or large long-term gas projects such as LNG infrastructure. And the timeframes are critical here. The oil and gas, the timeframes of the assets, both to build them and then to operate them, and the duration of expected revenues versus continued policy action on climate and ever accelerating technology development and adoption and deployment. So in terms of motivations to assess company climate alignment, we'll sort of group these into 3. Clearly, from an investor audience, our primary audience, we see that the assessment of assessment of company climate alignment is clearly an indicator of company transition risk exposure. A low carbon scenario is one where there is a fast energy transition. So effectively, the two are in some ways synonymous: low carbon, fast transition. But obviously, investors must act for their clients, including on climate, and they must, for those that have a sustainable or ESG mandate, must invest so. And that means assessing the climate alignment of individual companies. For financial institutions more broadly, be those asset managers or the banks and the insurers, there's the assessment of the own portfolio risk from a financial transition risk, but then the implications for the climate alignment of own activities, particularly from a financing perspective. So for banks, we see our analyses as critical. For those banks have a mandate to have or have set themselves goals around having climate aligned portfolios, seeking to maintain ultimately social license for activities such as retail banking. And then finally, from a policymaker and civil society perspective, we see it, our analyses, whether it's around emissions targets or production plans, are critical for broader set of stakeholders to assess which companies are credibly acting on climate and which might be viewed as not doing so. So, Carbon Tracker, we've developed 5 metrics to assess climate alignment and transition risk, and I'll talk through these in order. And what our intention is to frame, we have framed our annual reports, and we have a series of reports covering each of these themes, and then we'll be rolling all of these up together in a combined analysis of individual companies, both from and then look at that and a holistic approach to assessing companies, both individually, but also relatively against peers. So first, production plans, and we covered these within our Paris and Aligned report back in October. Are companies planning for production declines? 2, the second metric, capital allocation. Are companies allocating their capital, particularly in an upstream sense, both to existing projects, but crucially on new developments? Are those developments compatible with a low carbon scenario, with a Paris aligned scenario, with a rapid transition scenario? Are companies developing assets which are at risk of producing products, which they'll be reducing demand through the energy transition, ultimately as renewables substitute for fossil demand? 3, emissions targets, and obviously that is the focus of today's talk. Our emissions targets set by companies framed appropriately, and this is our absolute impact series of reports, including our hallmarks of Paris compliance, which Saeed will elaborate on in the next presentation. The 4th metric we see as crucial for assessing companies is looking at executive remuneration. Do personal incentives support the strategy of the business? And then finally, looking at climate risk disclosure, and I'd flag the work of our accounting, audit and disclosure team here around adequate reporting, critically looking at their flying blind series of reports and the accompanying accounting profiles covering companies across a number of sectors, both oil, gas, power and utilities, and more as well. So across these 5 metrics, we think it's able for a whole suite of different stakeholders can assess companies' climate alignment and transition risk across these 5 different metrics. And this forms the backbone of our analyses here at Carbon Tracker for the oil and gas team. So, having reviewed our framework for assessing companies, I'd now like to hand over to Saeed, who will be running through a high-level summary of our most recent report, Absolute Impact, focusing on company emissions targets.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Denia, for introducing me. To reintroduce myself, I'm Saeed. I just go by Saeed. I'm Research Associate for the Oil, Gas and Mining team, assessing emissions targets. So in a second, we are going to share our screen with you and our presentation. So generally, before we start talking about emissions targets and assessing emissions targets, I think it's quite useful to understand why it's so important to assess them in the first place. If you look at the slides here, we have 4 key bullet points. Firstly, we need to know how serious companies are about reducing their emissions. So it can be about pace, how fast emissions are going to go down, and also be about visibility, are emissions actually going to take place. The second is emissions targets can allow investors to assess the fit of the company within a particular investment product. For example, a climate-related fund. Third, emissions targets can indicate risk, and investors and asset owners, asset managers can use these to navigate reputational risks and legal risks, for example, those associated with greenwashing. And finally, emissions targets are part of a much wider, bigger corporate strategy. So using these, investors can assess whether the corporate strategy actually makes sense and whether emissions targets align with the other metrics. So next, we'd like to talk about the net zero ambitions in oil and gas. So oil and gas teams with net zero ambitions, and it may seem as though the industry is finally doing its part to achieve the global climate goals and to prepare for a future of lower oil and gas demand. However, our research shows otherwise. Most of the goals are not aligned. And to understand why not, we must first of all start with the question, what is a Paris-aligned goal? What makes a goal align? There are three key things: framing, pacing, and credibility. And while pacing and credibility ultimately decide whether the goal is aligned or not, we must make sure that we are assessing the right goals. We must make sure that the framing is right. So this is the core of our report. This is the core of this webinar. We'll be assessing the framing of goals. And here lies the key problem with emissions targets. Most of them are not framed appropriately, which means that there are key fundamental flaws in the way targets are framed. The first one, which on the screen, is emitting scope, and it's problematic. Why? Because scope 3 accounts for anywhere between 75 and 90% of and all those means to, what you see here is even, well, by definition, goals that do not account for scope 3 emissions cannot lead to net zero goals, to net zero across 1, 2, 3 by 2050. And this is problematic. Why? Because, well, without these, you do not know whether the company is going to miss or not its 2050 deadline. And the second of all, it may mean, as Mike has just said, the increased exposure to transition risks. This includes legal risks, this includes reputational risks, not just greenwashing, but also the risk of higher carbon taxes. So, next slide, please. Even when companies set net zero targets covering scope 1, 2, and 3, it's not entirely sure how companies are going to arrive at that net zero deadline. So what you see there is the problem is that companies lack interim goals on an absolute basis. And there are two components there. I'd like to start with interim. Why do we need interim goals? The thing is, the net zero goal without interim ambitions does not define the trajectory. So you don't know how much emissions are going to be emitted in between the baseline and 2050. And the second is the lack of absolute goals. Many companies set intensity-based targets. This means that we're not entirely sure what will be the volume of emissions emitted. Intensity is a measure of efficiency, as oil and gas companies say themselves, and you can't compare the global carbon budget and intensity. The other thing is sometimes some companies tend to compare the intensity of oil and gas projects today with the intensity of all energy products in the future. Well, this is not a like-for-like comparison, because by adding renewables to that all energy denominator, the denominator gets inflated, emissions do not increase, or do not decrease or increase, and that means to a drastically reduced ratio compared with, say, comparing ratios of oil and gas today to oil and gas tomorrow. If we look at the next slide, here we go to the problem of coverage. A lot of companies do not cover non-operated assets, the assets that they co-own but do not operate. The problem is that by co-owning and co-funding the assets, can we go back, please? By co-owning and co-funding the assets, the companies co-produce the product and they share in the revenue. So whatever the stake is, by co-producing the asset, by co-owning the asset, by co-owning the share of production, the company also co-owns the share of emissions. And as we've just seen, the problem of coverage does not stop there, because we also have third-party crude. Some companies, actually many companies, do not include third-party crude because they believe that this is not their product, not their problem. But to fully account for all emissions of the entire portfolio, the company must include third-party crude. So what we end up with is 5 criteria going into 3 hallmarks. This is the hallmarks of Paris aligned targets, formerly known as hallmarks of Paris compliance that Mike has just mentioned. So a target that meets all of these criteria, that meets all of the hallmarks, can be considered properly aligned. This does not mean that the company can be considered properly framed. This does not mean that the company is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. It just means that the company can go on to be assessed with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And you can use these hallmarks to assess any GHG emission target, which we just did, and this led to these results. What you see on your screens is the assessment of the best targets of 25 of the largest publicly traded oil and gas companies in the world. And you see that only Eni has cleared all 5 criteria, all 3 hallmarks. You can have some companies that met at least the first hallmark. Of these, there are companies that also met the second hallmark. You can see that Total, right at the bottom, this is alphabetically, has nearly got there, but it doesn't account for full equity share emissions. And we have BP and Repsol that have cleared the first 2 hallmarks, but have yet to account for the global activities. Now, I think this patchwork, if you will, clearly illustrates how important it is to have climate targets that are framed consistently, not just with each other, but also in line with the global ambition of the Paris Agreement. Now, you can use the same methodology, you can use the same hallmarks to produce a relative ranking of the companies, and you can see on the next slide. What happens here, you can use the hallmarks in 2 steps. The first step is to sort companies into 1 of 4 bands, and you do it going from the bottom up. So companies that do not clear even the first hallmark go into the bottom red band. The companies that meet the first hallmark but do not have net zero goals covering scopes 1, 2, and 3 go into the orange band. Companies that meet the first hallmark and do have net zero goals across scopes 1, 2, and 3, but do not have absolute targets on an interim basis, go into the yellow band. And well, obviously, companies that have cleared the first 2 hallmarks go into the blue band. And this is a picture of stagnation. If you look carefully, you can see 1 clear Atlantic divide on the table. And if you, for a second, ignore all the new entrants and just look at the companies that appeared in absolute impact last year, you'll see that the rankings have barely changed. This means that oil and gas targets, emissions targets in the oil and gas industry are not changing. And this means that the industry is for now content with the level of its ambition. Now, so far we've covered framing only, and this report focuses on framing. As I've said earlier, we also need to account for pacing and for credibility. Pacing means how fast the emissions go down, and credibility means whether emissions are real. So if pacing is quite obvious, I'd like to highlight credibility. What we say by credibility, we mean that emissions targets, approaches to reductions, must lead to actual reductions in global emissions. This means that emissions reductions or strategies should not rely unduly, first, on asset sales, which basically means transferring the assets and transferring the embedded emissions to someone else. The emissions will still be released in the future. Second, they should not unduly rely on carbon capture, utilization, and/or storage, or nature-based solutions, which either have not proven themselves yet at scale or require a lot of land use. And finally, they should not rely unduly on carbon offsets, because, well, this is an industry that itself needs to prove its credibility. So this concludes this whistle-stop tour of the report. There is a lot more in it. So how can you use it? I think that's 3 key points. You can use our key findings, which is the 2 tables that you've seen before on the slides, to assess companies and to quiz them on emission strategies if the targets found to be lacking. Second, you can use the appendix to track the goals, see any changes in them, or to assess performance against them. And I should like to mention that this includes not just the targets that we assess, but also targets that other emissions targets that we did not assess because they have been found to be weaker. And finally, this methodology that you've just seen, the hallmarks, the ranking methodology, can be incorporated into the screening processes that investors use in their own company selection methodologies. What this methodology is basically a checklist, so it's quite easy to slot into the methodology. So that's it for me. I am looking forward to the discussions.
Great. Thanks very much, Saeed. Thanks very much, Mike. That was great. Very clear. Got a bagload of questions coming in already. So we better crack on with this. Just by way of a brief further introduction to Rishi. As Evgenia said, he's currently the ESG Director in Strategy and Sustainability at BP. He began his career at BP as a geologist, similar to Mike, in upstream, before transitioning into strategy, where he played a role in framing BP's net zero ambition. He's also an ambassador for One Young World. This is a global forum of young leaders collaborating to find solutions to the world's most pressing issues, one of which, of course, is climate, as well as being a climate reality leader at the Al Gore founded Climate Reality Leadership Corp. So once again, thank you very much, Rishi, for joining us on this call. First question, got a couple of questions coming in a little bit. We talked a bit about credibility, and you touched on that. Mike, the report touches on credibility, but you haven't really fully integrated that into the assessment process. Is there a reason for that, or what's coming next?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think one thing I'll flag is we touched on credibility and expanded on a little bit more in last year's edition of this report. As Saeed said there, it's all about companies not effectively creating space in their budgets through asset sales. Ultimately, that doesn't actually isn't beneficial to climate. Not over-reliance on offsets, and also things like negative emissions technology, CCUS, and nature-based solutions. So why have we not accounted for that? Well, we are very much, our initial focus here is very much on the fundamental framing of company targets. And as we've seen in the presentation there, 24 of the 25 companies that we've included within our universe, 25 of the largest, some of the largest oil and gas companies, they do not meet those fundamental hallmarks. And if you don't meet those hallmarks, it's very hard to then go on to assess either pace or credibility. And so how I see this evolving is, as over time we've seen, and over the last 4 years, we've seen an improvement in company targets. We've seen a stagnation in them over the last 18 months. I'd hope that in the years to come, we see an improvement. And as more companies start to fulfill those fundamental hallmarks, then we will be able to evolve our analyses in order to assess both pace and credibility of their emissions reductions approaches.
Yeah, great, Mike. Thank you very much for that. Does any of the other panelists want to quickly chip in here on credibility, how they view credibility? Okay, so in our report, Rishi, in our report, we talk about the reluctance of some of your peers to set targets for Scope 3 emissions, or even report them. One argument is that they say they are powerless to act on emissions produced by others. Another argument is that just reporting Scope 3 emissions will lead to double accounting. Yeah, BP is one of the very few companies that do target Scope 3 emissions. Why did you choose to be more rigorous than others in this approach?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you, Simon, Mike, Said, for having me here, and congratulations to your team on the launch of the latest report, because I've no doubt it takes a lot of work to actually get these publications together, and they certainly provide a helpful perspective to our stakeholders in the conversations that we have. So on the question, Simon, at BP, we set our ambition back in 2020. And it was framed around two halves. The first half was around getting BP to becoming a net zero company, and that was by 2050 or sooner. And the second component was all around helping the world get to net zero too. And I think as we frame this, we set a number of very specific aims, and between them, as you mentioned, they cover scopes 1, 2, and 3. They cover absolute emissions reductions, as well as carbon intensity metrics, which in large part for us help us performance manage the growth of our transition businesses over time. And we set interim metrics for 2025 and 2030. Now, when we framed our approach, we considered our business activities across our value chain. And when we set the metrics, it was about setting metrics that help provide the view of the transformation of our business at each of these points. And so our first three aims are really all about getting to net zero across our operations, our upstream oil and gas production, and then the sales of energy products. And so if I just briefly touch on them, and then I'll get to the scope 3 point, the aim 1 is all around the operations. So that's our scope 1 and 2 emissions from running our assets. It's the actions we're taking ultimately to improve the operational efficiency of these assets over time. The second aim is all around our production. So that's our upstream oil and gas production. And in this case, it's about the carbon in the oil and gas production. And that's why it's our scope 3 aim. And the delivery for us is in large part actually driven by a reduction in how much oil and gas we produce over time. And we expect that to reduce by about 25% over the course of this decade versus our baseline year of 2019. But clearly, when we're looking at this, that's a supply metric. But as we know, that market forces, they're ultimately driven by both supply and demand. And ultimately, to help transition demand, customers need the alternatives. And I think that's why we have our third aim, which is all around the life cycle. It's a life cycle metric, carbon intensity of our energy product sales. And that in large part, I think, as I mentioned earlier, tracks this growing proportion of low carbon energy in our portfolio, which over time helps displace the higher carbon proportion as the world transitions. And that's why we have this specific focus on operations, production, and sales for net zero. And I think in terms of the why we include scope 3, well, in a way, Said has touched on some of this already. We did so because for us, the use of our energy products by customers, frankly, makes up the majority of the emissions in our value chain. And again, if I go back to the original ambition, it's clear for us, we want to get to net zero and help the world to get there. So this isn't just about BP, it's about playing our part in actually helping reimagine the broader energy system.
Okay, so that's great, Shin, and we've got a question here, and it begs obviously a follow-up question. Mm-hmm. Both Shell, what's coming next. Both Shell and BP scale back their ambitions this year. How did you at BP arrive at this decision to reduce the level of its ambition for cuts to its oil and gas production? And Mike, just a follow-up question, and I will repeat it, is that was the report done before or after the cuts were announced? But anyway, Richie, why did you arrive at this decision to reduce the ambitions?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I think, Simon, if I were to step back and reflect as we went on this journey, which led to some of the announcements that we made in February of this year, the world is in a really different place today to when we began this journey just 3 years ago. I think the challenges, the volatility that we've seen in the energy markets have made it clear, I think maybe clearer than ever, that the world both wants and needs a more balanced energy system. And I think that's one that can deliver more secure, more affordable, as well as lower carbon solutions, this so-called energy trilemma. And so I think to actually deliver that system, we need two actions. One, I think we need to accelerate the energy transition. The energy transition is the solution to all of the crises that we find ourselves in. And two, we need to ensure that that transition is both rapid and orderly from today's oil and gas-based system. And I think when I say orderly there, my focus again is on supply in tandem with demand to maintain that near-term energy security and affordability. And so this needs two things. It needs increased investment in lower carbon solutions, because that's what helps customers to decarbonize faster. And I think at the same time, it needs us to continue investment in hydrocarbons to keep the energy flowing with energy security at a premium in the near term. And I think one consequence of that, Simon, was as a result of the update, was a change to our pathway on aim 2. That's our net zero production aim, which I mentioned earlier. And on that, we're now targeting a 20 to 30% reduction by 2030. And that's largely reflecting this near-term challenge that I mentioned. But I think it's important to say that net zero destination is still unchanged. But I think what it does enable us to do, and this goes to the first action that I mentioned above, is this really enables us to invest extra into our transition. And so what we're doing as a result of this is we're investing an additional $1 billion a year. So that's on top of what we were already planning into our transition businesses, which we define as bioenergy, convenience and EV charging, renewables, and hydrogen. And to put that into context, just to illustrate the scale of change, back in 2019, when we set out on this journey, we invested about 3% of our capital, I think, into transition. By the end of last year, that was about 30%, so a tenfold increase. And that increase will continue by 2025. It will be over 40%. By 2030, it will be around 50% of our global investment. So that's in the order of about $55 to $65 billion invested in the transition over the course of this decade.
Mike, the first question, was this report done after the rollback or prior to that? I suspect it was done after, but just to confirm a simple question.
Yeah, the report was done after, and so accounts for those updated emissions targets from earlier in the year. I think it's important to. I think it's worth stressing that the fundamentals, in some ways, those changes don't actually alter the fundamentals of the way the targets are framed. So our emission, which is our focus, our emissions ranking. So we still see that BP is relatively ahead of Shell when it comes to the fundamental framing. But what it does do is affect the pace of change in both cases that we referred to earlier. So really, the overall emissions that will result from the future production from both companies will be slightly higher than had previously been planned. So we see it as a slightly retrogressive step, but I think it is still important to note that both companies are still lead in relative terms many of their other peers, particularly those North American, and for the first time in this year's analyses, a number of the largest national oil companies globally as well.
And there is, if I read the report right, there is a slight difference. Shell's ambitions tend to be intensity, or there's an element of intensity, whereas BP have just gone boom, it's absolute. Why does that matter? Just to remind us why intensity is just rubbish compared to absolute.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two main aspects to this. Why we see why we see it's critical that there are absolute targets rather than intensity. First, the climate and the atmosphere and global warming doesn't really care how much energy we use on the surface of the planet. What it cares about is the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So we need to be measuring companies' input by ultimately the absolute quantum of CO2 that's released. So hence the need for absolute targets, not intensity. The second part is that some companies, and Shell is an example of this, look at energy intensity, not just of their oil and gas production or portfolio, but across their oil energy portfolio. So under that metric, if you add renewables energy to your energy mix, your intensity can go down, but your absolute emissions may actually go up as a rate, or potentially could even be going up if you add sufficient renewables to your oil and gas. So again, if you just look at an intensity, particularly if it's on an all energy basis, you might see something's going down, but the reality is actually that organization's impact, or the impact results in that organization's activities could be increasing. And then ultimately, in assessing climate alignment, we should be looking at the pace at which companies are moving away from the legacy activities we need to leave behind us as society transitions to clean energy system, and not necessarily give credit for new things they're doing. Those new renewables don't necessarily offset ongoing operations in the legacy system, albeit that they are beneficial in their own rights to accelerate transition.
Okay, just want to touch a little bit more on what Richie said about energy security there, and I'm going to play a bit of a devil here, Mike side, if you've got some thoughts there. I mean, your reply, he talks about energy security, but we've got, you know, industry is now in sort of investing only 50% of its cash flow into traditional supply versus 85% a decade ago. You've got Saudi Arabia continually cutting their production to maintain the oil price, and they're now running 25% below their capacity. You've got global OEMs, auto OEMs, capex plans that effectively will provide 86 million electric vehicles very soon into the marketplace. By way of comparison, 2021, the global production of all cars was only 81. So you can see, you know, industry is telling us something. EV markets are accelerating. The numbers from the US, which is a laggard, are accelerating very quickly. Do you buy the sort of energy security narrative coming out of the industry? It's not just BP, it's all of them. And in fact, actually globally, governments as well. Any thoughts there, Saeed, Mike?
So I would say, obviously, energy security, clearly a hot topic for the last 18 months. But the term is used in a number of different ways and by a number of different actors, not least to help interests. But I think if we talk about energy security, we think about affordability, I think about accessibility, I think about independence, and we also sort of feel about other sort of national objectives. Ultimately, not every country can be a net exporter of energy. For oil and gas, not every country can produce and own its own its own fossil fuel supply. One of the great things about renewables and the rollout is the democratization of the production and the supply of energy. So we no longer rely or reduce our reliance on rogue nations and others for imports. That said, we can be seeking energy security. Energy security and achieving national net zero goals are not incompatible. But crucially, if a country or a government has a net zero goal, it still must pursue that, and it can't just go to, frankly, in some cases, unfounded energy security concerns in order to sort of put its net zero goals aside.
Okay, so let's get back to topic here. And Saeed, got a question for you. Are there any cases in your your study where emissions on a full equity share basis are lower than on an operational control basis? And would the recommendation in this case be still to use equity share accounting? I'm not sure there would be, but did you come across any of them?
Not yet. What we do is we're not assessing targets per se. So for say a particular company, we do not know how many emissions are produced from operated assets and how much emissions are produced from non-operated assets. So I may not be able to give an answer to that question, but generally, the company, largely a company, owns and operates its own assets. And in JVs, even if it accounts for equity share from even if it happens that all non-operated assets are negative. So the lowest value that full equity share emissions can go down to is operational emissions. Again, if non-operated assets are zero and operated assets say 100 tons of CO2 equivalent, the lowest that the full equity share can go down to is the value of operational emissions. So I think it is still really important to account for emissions on a full equity share basis, both from non-operated assets and operated assets. It's a sum.
Okay, and another follow-up question, Said, if I might, to give Mike and Rishi a moment. Why take such a hard line on the absence of interim targets when, you know, a company has committed to reaching net zero by 2050?
Well, I'm not sure if we can go back to the slide. Not sure we should. You saw on the slides that a company can have a net zero goal, and as I said, the trajectory to that net zero goal can vary. So, for example, theoretically, a company can keep producing the same amount of emissions that it produced at its baseline, say in the year 2019, all the way through to year 2049. So it's 6 megatons per year, all the way through, and then cease operations in 2050. What would happen? Technically, the company would achieve its net zero goal, but at the same time, its cumulative emissions would be huge. So what we need is a pathway that shows incremental reductions, starting ideally in the short term, going through the midterm, and all the way to the long term to net zero. That way, the pathway, instead of being flat, will become a curve, downward curve. And the steeper it is, the sooner the reductions in emissions, the better aligned the target. And that is basically what is decided. That is basically what goes into the assessment of pacing.
So Simon, I'd add one additional comment. I totally agree with what Saeed just said. At a really high level, net zero has become synonymous with 1.5 in many circles. The reality is the two are not the same. To be on a 1.5 and a 1.5 low overshoot pathway, we need to reach net zero global emissions around mid-century. But we need to do that on a given pathway. And as Saeed says, we can't just continue to emit and then fall. So it's critical that when we talk about net zero and net zero pathways, we talk about the temperature goal that's associated with them, because that ultimately dictates the pathway, both at an overall level and then also then at the company level too.
Okay, Rishi, here's one for you. When you look at that chart, you know, BP does a lot right. I mean, they're in the top, near the top. But one of the areas that they don't is targeting emissions embedded in third-party crude or scope 1 or 2 emissions from non-operated assets. This seems quite an easy one to me. You know, I haven't been in the business, but it seems quite an easy one. You've done quite a number of the hard ones. Why not this one?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So maybe if I tackle the question on the crude first. So we actually do include third-party crude in our aims, Simon. So maybe let me give a bit of a clearer explanation. So firstly, in terms of the crude that we produce, our aim 2, as we've put it previously, covers the crude oil and natural gas that we produce in our upstream business. And I think the logic there is if all upstream producers of oil and gas did the same, you'd get to net zero for the world. As far as our downstream sales are concerned, that's covered by our aim 3 in those first 3 aims that I mentioned. That's for a sales metric for our energy products. And actually the way we define energy products in that aim, crude oil itself isn't actually considered to be an energy product. But actually our aim 3 does include the energy products that we sell, which are ultimately derived from crude, and that includes third-party sourced crude. And I think, Simon, to answer on why we have that approach, we chose that because ultimately it avoids us counting the emissions twice. So you'd count the emissions from the crude oil as well as the emissions from the refined products generated from the same crude oil. And our definition on our aim 3 focuses on the products, and that's why we take the cut. And then I think on your second part of your question around the non-operated assets, our aim around our operations, our aim 1, is on the basis of our operations within our direct control. So in industry terms, that's what we define as assets where BP is the operator. And we choose that basis ultimately because operational control makes the most sense when you're trying to make the kinds of interventions that we do. It's things, you know, like electrifying your facilities, improving the energy efficiency of what you do. And ultimately, in those cases, being the operator is an advantage to actually being able to make these changes. But for those assets, and I think this touches on that prior question of can operated or non-operated or equity cuts be bigger or smaller, I think it's important to say that for the assets which we cover under our aim 1, so that's our operated assets, we account for 100% of the equity in those assets. So that's regardless of our actual equity share in the asset itself. But of course, I think this is also a question about transparency. And what we do additionally to covering the operated assets in our aim 1 is also include in our reporting the emissions associated on an equity share basis as well. So we give transparency of both, and we let our stakeholders have the information that they need, and that's updated on an annual basis to provide with that transparency. And then I think the final thing I would add there is we do have a process also in place to try and manage this issue of non-operated assets. And that includes a number of processes, including ways that we try and encourage our partners who might be the operators of these other assets on the aspects of sustainability, including, but of course not limited to carbon.
Okay, so Mike's side, we've heard Rishi's explanation, and this slight, you know, why be so specific about targets? And Rishi, in his explanation, touched on one of a question from the audience, saying that, you know, there's quite a number of ways that each company report their own emissions, if you like. So why be so specific on I don't think I even got that right anyway, on those targets? And also, how do you get around the problem? How do you get around the way that actually, you know, the reporting is sometimes different? So, Mike, over to you.
Can I start with the general comment? Thank you, Rishi. On net zero sales, which is an intensity metric, the reason we could not include the third-party crude in the final report, in the assessment, is we assessed the combination of aims 1 and 2, and these are the goals that have absolute interim absolute targets. And for intensity, for aim 3, which is intensity, we could not combine, so we omitted that. So that's for the benefit of our readers if they compare the report, compare the notes. And on the complexity of targets, you've seen yourself on the table. The final ranking table is actually a lot wider. There are a lot more granular metrics, as I mentioned before. And it is indeed really hard to compare them. So you need to dig deep into the reports, you need to dig deep into the corporate filings. And unless and until companies themselves come to realize, or if unless the regulations require that they disclose all emissions to set appropriate targets, this problem of misaligned, misframed targets will persist. And well, all that's left to do is to continue tracking the targets and to see which are doing better, which are framed more expansively in a more comprehensive way than others.
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in just briefly, Simon, it's a valid point, I think, Saeed. And I think, in a way, one of the issues we highlight here is there are many different approaches that companies are taking on this. And frankly, that doesn't always make it easy for stakeholders to compare apples with apples. And we've certainly found this. I think some of the work that bodies such as yourselves do certainly help stakeholders with trying to make a bit more of an apples with apples comparison. But again, as we've acknowledged even here, there are complexities in doing so. But ultimately, this is why having an ability to articulate your contribution across different points of the value chain, I think are helpful. But I think very valid points made, Saeed.
Great.
Yeah.
Mike, do you want to add anything, or I've got another question, I think, in particular for you.
So I would very briefly add, and then happy to take the next one. So I think our focus, as I said, it's about, because of the difference in reporting, we don't really, and I really encourage investors to not get into the intricacies even of how expecting us, or how exactly the 4th decimal place of emissions targets, and then companies can say, hey, we can't measure it that accurately, so we can't disclose it. You get into this standoff. So for us, it's taking a step back and looking at, okay, what is the fundamental framing? Because ultimately, why are companies setting climate targets? Well, they're setting climate targets to maintain their social license to operate, communicate to investors to continue, and other financial institutions to continue to attract capital, and maintain shareholders and act for those shareholders that do have a sustainability mandate and do want to see the company's transition. So hence, if that's the reason for setting targets, then we focus on the fundamental framing, and hence we've derived our hallmarks, which we believe are beneficial to investors, particularly in cutting through the noise and simplifying things and actually identifying who is potentially Paris aligned, and which of the companies are the leaders, and crucially which are the laggards in this space.
Okay. So question here, given some of the known issues in setting Paris-aligned Scope 3 targets, demand-driven, significant asset sales, etc., do you have a view on a credible alternative to assess net zero strategies? Mike?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll take the question as net zero strategies as meaning a strategy to align the company. I think there's two aspects. One is the strategy to align the company with a net zero, and by that I take the question to mean Paris aligned, given our earlier conversation, pathway, and then separately, how is the company preparing itself for a low carbon energy system? And in the first part, as I alluded to in my opening comments, yes, we can look at emissions targets, but we can also look at production guidance. And actually, BP is one of the few companies to acknowledge that its production volumes will fall as a result of the transition, the demand substitution effects. Many of its peers do not actually. So that would be one aspect. Other, it's capital decision making, and is it continuing to invest in projects that are incompatible and just frankly not needed in a low carbon pathway? And then finally, assessing strategies in terms of what are the executive team incentivized to do. So that's sort of assessing the pace, assessing the strategy to become net zero Paris aligned on a kind of moving away from the legacy industry, but looking forward to a net zero system. It's that same risk piece, but actually, how is the company transitioning its business if it chooses to transition? It could be just increasing the distributions back to shareholders, which may be a credible strategy and the right one to protect shareholder value over time. But if it is continuing to invest, how is that capital, that mix of capital shifting towards businesses that are sustainable in a low carbon world? Now, those could be a renewable energy generation, could be other things related to energy. So it could be, as Rishi talked about there, electric vehicle charging points, but it could be a whole host of other businesses too. So let me pause there. A whole range of metrics would be the answer.
Okay, so we're getting to the top of the hour, and we have got a lot of questions, and for those who haven't had their questions answered, we'll try and get back to you when we have your details. And yes, a recording should be available to all of those who have attended the meeting, subject to the technical aspects of that. Last real question to sort of, Mike, Saeed, and we'd love to hear, Rishi, your thoughts on this, is that the report shows this classic divide between the European companies, the American companies, and the state-owned companies. Would be interested just to hear, from Mike, Saeed, your view on perhaps some of the reasons, and then Rishi, from your side, I mean, you're in it, in the business, and your competitors, quite frankly, are getting away with murder, and you're actually trying to stand up and be counted. How that must be frustrating for you. So, just some thoughts about why you think that is. Mike, Saeed, over to you first, and we've got just a couple of minutes, so we'll.
Sure. So I think, that Atlantic divide, well, I think it reflects a number of things, not least societal awareness and sort of societal concern over climate and cross Atlantic. That is perhaps changing political environment over the last 5-10 years as well. But clearly there's an investor appetite and the concept of fiduciary duty, and frankly, the misnomer that climate and the energy transition more broadly is some ESG factor that will get dismissed. Fundamentally, the demand substitution risk is a mainstream financial risk and probably one of the biggest risks facing those investing in the oil and gas industry, and it should be incorporated within fundamental analysis. Ultimately, I think these companies and some of the more progressive European companies are in effect stuck in transition. You've seen the efforts, for example, of Shell, its Capital Markets Day in New York, looking to appeal to that US investor audience, which are potentially halting or holding back some of its efforts to transition as well.
Richard, you're trying to do the right thing. How frustrating is it for you?
Thanks, Simon. I mean, firstly, it's not for me, I think, on our peers. But I think the reality is, when we think about the energy transition, it presents a very complex challenge, but I think also a very tremendous opportunity for companies in our sector. But of course, I think how a company chooses to play in the space is dependent on a whole host of aspects. You know, it could be one's current portfolio, your geographical footprint and the impact of policy in those geographies. It could be the impact of, you know, how you're influenced by one's broader view of the world. We've saw a number of scenarios on the slides from Said, just trying to illustrate the uncertainty of the pathways that might follow. It could be the areas in which a company might feel best suited to actually leverage its skill set to be distinctive and ultimately win in the transition. But I think importantly also, and Mike, I think, touched on this, we all exist in a societal ecosystem. And so I think we need to consider the influence of key stakeholders, be it your staff, your shareholders, or indeed your customers. And I think once you navigate all of that, actually setting an ambition and a strategy to consider your business footprint across that value chain is ultimately what informs how you frame your transformation.
Great. Rishi, thank you very much. Mike, Said, thank you very much for joining us. And also thanks to Evgenia and the team behind the scenes that make this all possible. And also thank you very much to you, the audience, for coming on. Some great questions. Sorry we didn't get through to them, and we'll try and get back to you. Just a couple of things we've got coming up next. I think Mike and his team are updating Managing Peak Oil pretty soon, so look out for that. Mike himself will be in New York for the Climate Week, and so if you're based in New York and you'd like to perhaps meet up or get in touch, then please get in touch with me and we can try and make that happen. From the P&U team, we've got a Kazakh report which is coming up quite shortly, and that's an interesting one. It is going to look at the potential systemic transition pathway for Kazakh as a country on its power and utilities system, and hopefully that can be used as a template for stakeholders, investors, to look at how other countries might be able to transition their power needs and power system. So thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. And bye-bye.
Bye.